Hi, everybody. Welcome to our session on climate change. For those of you in the audience who are not part of APCO, I'm Marjorie Krause. I'm the founder and executive chair of APCO. And we have three great guests with us today, two of whom are colleagues at APCO, and one is a close friend of APCO. And our goal today is to have a robust discussion about climate and about where things stand and what we need to know to better inform our clients, and whether you're in-house and you're informing senior management, or whether you're part of APCO and you are really trying to understand how to best advise companies going forward. We thought this was important for two reasons. One is that in the whole pandemic time, as I've been sitting in roundtables with other CEOs and corporate leaders, the subject of climate has become front and center for everybody. I think the combination of the events of the last year and people really understanding by being home the impact of clean air and what we're, just a real focus on what we're doing to our environment, coupled with coming of age, I think, of looking to COP26. And I think there's a realization now that we're all in this together and we need to do something substantial. And so every company is on a journey of some kind to figure out where they fit in the discussion on climate, what they can do, how to move forward, and how they are going to be held accountable. And so we want to talk a little bit about that and make sure that we cover those elements. And while I'm thinking of it, if you have questions as we go along, please put them in the chat, because we want this to also be interactive. I'll start with a few questions to tee things up, but then I'll turn to you so we make sure we get your questions answered. The second reason I thought it was really important to do this is that APCO a few weeks ago, as most of you know, formed a group called APCO Impact. And we took the resources that we had within the company and then added to it, because we thought that none of these things stand alone. So APCO Impact is the combination of experiences on climate, on equity and justice, on gender, on ESG, and on purpose, on all of these things. Because we also think that, and at the end of the day, it is about climate justice. It's about trying to do things as we move forward in a more equitable way that impacts these other areas, and that we can't think of ESG as a separate part of a company anymore, that these things are all very integrated into the way companies think about their future and plan for their future. And so I'm very excited to have this conversation. So let me introduce our panelists. Because we were moving into climate in a bigger way, we decided that we needed somebody to really just focus on climate and what we were doing. And we were lucky enough to recruit to APCO Heather McGorry, who is now our lead person on climate and sustainability. And the impact team has welcomed her. She has more than 20 years experience on this subject, and most recently was the chief operating officer of the We Mean Business Coalition, which she helped to organize. And this is driving the world's most influential companies to net zero by 2040. And so she's been a very early advocate and organizer in the business community and elsewhere on climate. And we've been very lucky and impressed to benefit from her expertise. And so our other APCO colleague on the call is Judith Aramis, who many of you know. This is Judith's second tour of duty, if you want to call it that, at APCO. She started as my chief of staff, so I'm very glad to see her back. But a lot of you might not know some things about Judith, and that prior to joining rejoining APCO, she was the director of external relations for IDLO, the International Development Law Organization, where she led their external positioning on various things relating to the rule of law. But she also served at the UN as the chief negotiator for the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, and contributed to the adoption of Goal 16. So when we talk about climate and we talk about climate justice, the whole part of this that relates to the justice part of this, Judith is very much engaged in helping to create those definitions and those inner links. And she has a long history before that, but Judith is going to help us understand some of the more international implications of this discussion and how these multilateral institutions are working on this together as well. And so our third guest is Ann Kelly. And Ann is the Vice President for Government Relations and leads something called the Ceres Policy Network. And Ceres is a not-for-profit that has a very ambitious goal. It's to transform the economy to build a just and sustainable future for people and planet. And that is a very ambitious agenda. And Ann is an environmental lawyer. She has 25 years of experience in the public and private sector and a very long resume. And I think that the thing that's the most exciting today, Ann, is that she's just come off a summit on Capitol Hill for her organization, where she has engaged with the latest thinking from the policy community on what is happening now and where this is likely to go. And so we could not be more current than having Ann, and we really appreciate your being here. So why don't we start by just maybe creating some framework or definition around what we're talking about. And Heather, I'm going to turn to you. Could you, with all this discussion about ESG, and then, people appointing environmental stewards in their companies and everything else, how does that relate to this climate discussion? What are we really talking about? What is the framing of this, and why is it so important?
Yeah, that's a great question to start with. And I think that what we're seeing, particularly with colleagues like Julie, Jack, and Jeff Zelkowitz, is that a lot of companies are finding that they're being asked by investors, and Ann can also comment on this later. They're being asked by investors to provide more reporting and disclosure around environmental, social, and governance issues. And that includes climate, water, diversity, equity, and inclusion. How are you structuring your boards, and how is employee and senior level compensation structured, and and all of these reporting functions to MSCI and CDP and others. And it's a key entry point, I think, for APCO in particular, because it's where companies are starting to figure out, okay, how do I work through this? And so it's an amazing entry point. And then I think it connects into the broader conversation on climate, which is, as an economy, as a global economy, we're now trying to move towards driving to net zero. And that means that we're also trying to halve our emissions by 2030. And so Judith can talk more about the international process pieces, but that's where we're trying to get to. And then I think that starts to filter down into, okay, what does that mean for individual companies as they're being asked to contribute essentially to that global emissions reduction shift? And so certainly ESG is a big trend. I think we're seeing so many conversations on that, and it's really great to see that all in the response for getting to net zero. And I think, and Ann can talk about this in a little bit, which is also its response to regulatory pressure that I think we're starting to see coming out of both the Biden administration and the US. I think it's really been established in Europe already, right? And so a lot of the European companies are a bit further along there. And then particularly ones who also operate in the United States, that's filtering through, but then there's also all of the regulatory pieces from the climate-related financial risk executive order that came out around the Earth Summit in April. And so climate finance overall, just to broaden it out a little bit, is something that is that regulatory response, and also has become, I think, for many companies, an acknowledgement that there's business risk associated with not identifying climate risk, right? And disclosing that has not become mandatory yet, but a lot of companies have been and are figuring out what that means for their businesses now, because these things start to really become business decisions and not just social good decisions. And also, I think the just transition is another piece that's partly ESG, but part of a broader conversation, to the SDGs, right? More international, multinational companies with bigger footprints tend to think about it as the SDGs, and then others think about it much more locally and community related of where their operations are. And then I think also, again, ESG related, but broader climate related into the how do we change the whole economy and drive to net zero? And it's supply chains is another important point for companies as they're figuring out what their footprint is and how to disclose their financial exposure around climate. They have to start looking into their supply chains, and then that usually gets global very quickly. And then the last thing I'll say is that the climate conversation expands still when you start to get into nature-based solutions. And so the nature-based solutions is then also starts to lean and move into the conservation conversation around land use and water use. And so while we start to talk about things very concretely, it very quickly gets to talking about many more topics, all of which we're asking companies and ourselves to become really expert in, and it's quite a challenge. So that's one reason actually why I thought it'd be great to have Anne here, because she has lots of detail on the U.S. and regulatory and administrative and legislative piece, which is just, there's so much to discuss and to explore that it's hard to keep up with all of it.
So I'm going to turn to Anne in a minute, but I just want you to think about, before we finish today, we should try to help people understand the journey that companies are on, because people are at different stages of that journey. If we were advising a company or looking inward to ourselves or any of the people on who are clients of APCO, what does that journey look like, and what are the pitfalls along the way from what you've seen at We Mean Business and elsewhere? Don't answer it yet, but think about it, because I'm going to turn to Anne. And since you were just yesterday collecting all this information, having all these discussions, what does Build Back Better look like right now in the discussions in the policy world, especially with the infrastructure bill? And where are people's heads on Capitol Hill? And is this leading to bipartisanship, or is this going to be one of those things that is divisive?
Well, thanks for the question, Marjorie, and thanks so much for the invitation today. As Heather notes, she just did a beautiful job of framing this in its broadest context, and our challenge will be to be narrow enough to be useful to you all. And so thank you for your spot-on question. The context for that is that yesterday we had 84 companies and investors working Capitol Hill, of course, virtually, but really pressing lawmakers to push a bipartisan, durable infrastructure package through that has very specific climate elements. And as you know, President Biden laid out the American Jobs Plan in no uncertain terms. And what we had the companies do, we're a bipartisan organization. We represent companies who are forward-thinking, who are high achievers, but many, many popular names that you would know, Salesforce and Microsoft and several others. We're pushing for those elements of the American Jobs Plan that specifically address climate. And so we didn't, just to be clear, we're not pushing for a particular agenda. We're pushing for these critical elements. And to be specific, we're pushing for building up the clean energy sector. You know, the US has in the past invested in railroads. We invested in the internet. We invested in the interstate highway system. This is a moment where we have to build up the clean energy sector specifically. And that's in the American Jobs Plan, but it's in many other bills as well. And from a corporate perspective, that's helpful, because in order to meet the kind of targets and goals that companies have established, they need access to renewable energy. They absolutely need a clean, accessible, dynamic grid. So modernization of the grid is another one of the key elements we are looking for. Clean transportation, the electrification of transportation, of course, a key element of the jobs plan, but again, key to so many companies who are looking to electrify. And then all of this framed in the context of equity and environmental justice. So to Marjorie's question, are we getting anywhere? What does this package look like? Well, we are in the thick of negotiations, and we were struck that yesterday President Biden actually was meeting with Leader Schumer and Speaker of the House Pelosi and Mitch McConnell and Kevin McCarthy all at once in a 5-person conversation. And we can imagine what that was like. There's no question that the divisions in Capitol Hill right now are stunning. I think what we saw, the stunning last couple of days with the way that Representative Liz Cheney has been treated, I think are indicative of the kinds of divisions that exist post January 6th, and given what we've been through the last 4 years. So you would have reason to believe that, well, these people are never going to be able to cooperate with one another. And I want to disabuse you of that notion here and now. Again, we are constantly pushing for bipartisan legislation. In the context of an infrastructure bill, given the filibuster rule, we really need to win over 10 Republicans. Notice what has just happened in the last few weeks. We passed a water infrastructure bill through the Senate, and that's a bill to replace all of the lead pipes. So again, a deep environmental justice theme here. That passed with 98 votes. It was really a stunning bipartisan achievement. And Senator Carper yesterday, who's head of the Environment and Public Works Committee, highlighted that for us. That was a real achievement. Notice the methane rule that came through the Congressional Review Act. There were 3 Republicans that joined a vote that said, yeah, we're going to scrap the Trump limitations on methane, the Trump administration's rule, and we're going to put in a stronger rule. That's going to go forward, again, with bipartisan support. The Growing Climate Solutions Act is a wonderful bill that would incent farmers to start to sequester carbon as part of their agricultural practices. Senator Braun, Republican from Indiana, Senator Stabenow, Democrat from Michigan, bipartisan bill. They have at least 17 Republicans and 17 Democrats on that bill. I know both categories are increasing now. So agriculture has been a place for actually building bipartisan cooperation. I think the other thing to remember is that the American Rescue Plan was richly supported in the states. And so Republicans and Democrats alike really wanted to see that bill through. Unfortunately, the politics got in the way of the policy. I've had some of my Republican allies tell me, if we could just do a secret ballot, you'd have many more Republicans supporting this agenda. But the kind of atmosphere that's been created, unfortunately, because of the repercussions of the last 4 years, create divisions that don't really reflect what people on the ground want and need. If you went to the Yale Climate Communications website, yaleclimatecommunications.org, the fantastic data, what they've shown is that bipartisan majorities in the states actually want to see the clean energy economy develop. They want to see the transition to a renewable energy economy. They want to see fossil fuel workers, former coal and fossil fuel workers, being employed in a way that gives them new opportunities, new training, in particular, closing down some of those old sites. Don't take my word for it. This is all really well documented. So that's kind of a stunning reality that we actually have voters, citizens, your customers, employees who really want to see this transition happen. Unfortunately, we've got some work to do in Washington, made more difficult, as I said at the beginning, from those who are still questioning the results of the election, that this creates a bit of a credibility gap. All that said, we remain optimistic and hopeful. After yesterday, we had 66 meetings on the Hill, and the conclusion is that I think there is enough common ground that there will be pieces of the infrastructure bill. I'm not saying it's going to be in one fell swoop. Likely there'll be pieces that will, in fact, enjoy a bipartisan majority. And then I think there'll be elements of the bill that probably need to go through budget reconciliation with the 51 votes, with the Democratic caucus holding itself together. And so that's a combination of things. It's not perfect, but my sense is that we will see something done between now and the August recess. And that in and of itself is exciting. And that's only on the congressional side. I'll stop there, but happy to talk about the executive branch, which is its own administrative authority.
So, Anne, I thank you for that. That was really helpful. I think when we come back to you and we get into the practical side of this, it would be useful to understand too whether there are things coming down the pike from a regulatory or other direction that companies need to prepare for as well. So this is your I think perspective was like wind at our back. Where is the wind coming the other way that that will meet these companies, and maybe for some will be very difficult, but all part of a process of moving the country forward. So Judith, so can you give us more of an outside in look? What else is happening as we move toward COP26? What do you see happening with places like the UN and the upcoming General Assembly? How's that going to impact what's happening, what we've heard about in the US?
Thank you, Marjorie. It certainly will be a really interesting year. I think the first thing that we have to take into account is the COVID pandemic pushed off and delayed a lot of the major discussions. And I think, COP was meant to take place last year in Glasgow for obvious reasons. It got postponed. There are a couple of other key international processes that are also dovetailing into this. A review at the UN of the Biodiversity Convention, the Oceans Conference, and at the same time, a review of the UN food systems in the Food Systems Summit, all of which I think are important conversations because they touch on different perspectives and different parts of this bigger notion that we've been talking about, which is about the need to really take urgent action to protect the planet. And climate change is one of these issues, of which has obviously, for obvious reasons, and given the climate emergency and the need to take urgent action, is being very much pushed forward. I think some of the statistics about what happened last year are really interesting. That, we anticipated that there would be a 6% drop in greenhouse gas emissions in 2020 as a result of the obvious sources of the fact that people were actually staying at home, that business travel and overall travel dropped dramatically. But what is actually very eye-opening is that that was still short, even though that was a significant drop of 6%, it was still short of the 7.6 annual reduction that is required to actually limit global warming to the 1.5 degree target, which scientists have told us is what we need to be focusing on. So what this means is there is greater awareness. The fact that the US is coming back into the fold with the change of the Biden administration removes one of the major obstacles. And in fact, what we've seen globally and internationally is what John Kerry, as Special Envoy for Climate, is doing, is really rallying the troops, rallying all those countries, his visits, his initiatives, his visit to the UAE, his visit to India, they really have been a game changer in terms of the support that he's giving to the UK COP presidency around the fact that governments will have to come together in COP in November in Glasgow, but that it can't be just coming together to talk, it's going to be coming together for action. And I think that's actually where all these pieces come together, that we know that tackling the climate emergency is going to require all of us coming together. And that means not just the individual level, because everyone can contribute at the individual level, but it's also government, civil society, the private sector, and multilateral organizations really working together to identify fast track solutions. And I emphasize this because I think what we're hearing and what we know and what the science is telling us is that the clock is ticking, and it's ticking fast. So the focus has got to be not just on big and bold climate ambition, but it's got to be on very, very innovative solutions that tackle the worst and the most serious problems so that we can really accelerate towards change. What is exciting about this year is that at the UN, we see climate being mainstreamed into all of the conversations. Whatever you hear, wherever you go, you actually hear people talking about climate and being very mindful that that is an issue that guides across and that we need to be addressing from different perspectives.
So I just want to remind everybody that we are going to take questions in a minute from from all of you, and please feel free to put them in the chat box or in the Q&A, I guess, that is at the bottom of the screen. So I'd like to switch the conversation to some of the practical elements for the people who are listening. I think now we've talked generally about what our environment is like for climate, but what do companies need to know, Heather, from your experience at We Mean Business? What is the journey? What is appealing? How do we get companies motivated to do this if they aren't already motivated?
Yeah, that's a great question. And Anne and I are colleagues, former colleagues from We Mean Business too. So she can speak to this as well, and works directly with companies. But I can just start out by saying, I think 6 years ago when We Mean Business was just forming, and it was formed a lot to show up at the what's now been the Paris Agreement, but those negotiations, and able to bring the progressive business voice to that forum, and give policymakers that understanding that business was behind this activity. And I think in the last 6 years, we've moved really far to now where companies themselves are coming out with initiatives around climate, right? And so it's just like mushroomed. I don't think anyone 6 or 7 years ago would have thought we would be like, wait, Amazon, Microsoft, like you guys have all these initiatives. Hold on, we have, the nonprofits have these initiatives too. And I think what is part of everyone's trying to fill this vacuum that's normally filled by policy, right? And so trying to figure out as a company, there's the landscape just keeps getting more and more crowded, and figuring out, okay, what are the things that I need to do that are essentially aligned with being effective regardless of all of these different measures. And I think I've shared this with many colleagues already, and I'll share it again. And there's two things. One is the Climate Action 100 Plus Net Zero Company Benchmark, and that series is an integral part of that coalition and the work that's happening there. And that starts with setting ambition. And in fact, I had a conversation with colleagues and a client last week where they said, we're setting an ambition and we don't have a plan. And I was like, that's great. That's number one on the roadmap, is just get there and say that you're going to do it. And then from there, you're setting up targets and goals around what it means to be net zero or to have emissions, developing a decarbonization strategy, aligning your investments to go along with that. And Anne mentioned this before, also aligning your trade associations memberships, looking at those and looking at that against your own corporate climate policy. And many times companies find that they have potentially a more progressive climate policy than some of the trade associations that they're involved with. Looking at governance, how C-suite people are being, bonuses being connected to performance on climate issues. Then the just transition piece, and then finally, of course, reporting that all back out publicly through annual reports, shareholder meetings, and then any of the agencies as well. And just to also note that looking at it in the reverse engineering way, sometimes companies are looking at, okay, what am I being asked to report on by MSCI or ES or CDP, and then kind of tick through it in that order, and flip backwards. And then I'll also just say that in terms of specific initiatives, the Science Based Target Initiative has really gotten quite a lot of traction over the last few years, and has become, I would say, pretty standard participation table stakes as companies are developing their decarbonization strategies. They're often signing up to a science-based target. And that's a collective effort from WRI, CDP, and WWF. And I don't know if you want to add anything else there on company initiatives.
I think Margie was going to ask you a follow-up question.
No, well, actually, we've had a comment from somebody who's on the phone who was the CEO of a company and wanted to, had some comments from his own real life experience. So, Anne, why don't you go ahead, and then Swami will come to you next.
Yeah, I appreciate what Heather is saying. And I think answering this key question, what should companies expect? How should they prepare? I mean, I guess there's one answer to that. And then I think there are 4 pressure points to highlight. The one answer is, the laws are going to change. The Biden administration represents a sea change in terms of rebuilding our environmental law infrastructure, in terms of making administrative rules more stringent. Remember that as an executive branch, there's a lot Biden can do on his own, on the administration's own, without Congress. So strengthening air pollution rules, methane regulations, fuel economy economy standards, a whole slew of regulations. But for this group, perhaps the most significant is that mandatory climate risk disclosure is coming. The SEC has been very clear about making climate risk disclosure mandatory. Many of your clients have probably been involved in the TCFD process. It was 11 years ago that Ceres filed guidance with the SEC on how to do climate risk disclosure. So there's been a lot of time for practice and experience in this way. But it's really important because when investors have this uniform decision useful information, those companies that have been doing a good job of tracking their emissions and have a real strategy are going to be in the winning spot. I mean, those who are behind are going to have to reveal the way in which they're behind, both in terms of revealing emissions data, scope 1 through 3, but also what's the plan, what's the strategy, what's the transition plan for those perhaps who are major emitters who really need to think about the transition to a clean energy economy. So that's a game changer. Comments were due with the SEC on June 13th. In a general way, we expect a draft rule in the fall. This has been anticipated for a long time. President Biden mentioned it on the campaign. Our investor coalition, of course, can't wait to see these come forward. It's a long time coming. And again, mandatory is really different from having these be voluntary. If you've dealt with your SEC lawyer, you know how difficult it is to get things into the 10K, but that's really where it needs to be so we can make these decisions, investors can make these decisions. So we could talk about that all day, but I would anticipate that if I were a company. I think the 4 forces of pressure points, one is what Heather alluded to, which is that investors are really engaged in this work now. When we started, and Ceres began in 1989, investors were still coming up to speed on ESG and what this all meant. They're really savvy now on what it is they need to pressure companies to do in terms of performance. And that's only going to be ratcheted up. It's not just Ceres that's involved with this. I mean, there's PRI, there's several other investor organizations. So this is global, and that should be anticipated. And they're getting savvy about the full range of environmental issues, from deforestation to water scarcity to climate risk and beyond. Secondly, the left-leaning groups are something that is striking to me. Having been in this field a very long time, I am struck by what's the word I could use, the audacity perhaps of the left-leaning groups that are not part of Ceres. They're adjacent, or they're distant from us actually, but I hear about them because I pay attention to Twitter, and occasionally I see them commenting on our work. Bill Weil, formerly with Google and Facebook, is really mobilizing against the tech companies to make sure that they're acting appropriately and that they're specifically engaged on responsible policy. He's volunteering to go into a company and organize the employees against management. I have to tell you, that was not happening 5 years ago. He's in touch with the employee groups in a company like Amazon, with his former colleagues at Google. That's a pressure point. And that leads to the second pressure point, which is your employees. Employees of major companies, whether they're millennials or not, really, and the data is now proving this out, they want to work for responsible companies, and they want their companies to do something on climate. Period. And that's just how it is. So not only do you have to be aware of your companies and responding to their needs of their employees, but they may actually mobilize and organize against you. And that's significant. I don't think, I mean, who knows what motivated Amazon to do the stunning work around the Amazon pledge, but one can hardly think that they were ignoring the employees who erupted from within. The other pressure point, I think, is from customers. Customers are increasingly surveyed and want to support companies that are acting in a responsible way. And given social media, it's very easy, and you guys are experts in corporate reputation, I don't have to tell APCO this, but it's very easy for a company to have a misstep and then to have a boycott, and then to be targeted in social media in a negative way that doesn't really support your employee interests or your customer interests. And then again, both of those contribute to that kind of left-leaning advocacy that we're seeing. I mentioned Bill Weil, but there's several groups who are really keeping their eyes open on companies and looking to target even individuals in a very specific way through social media, that I think is something to pay attention to. Now, whether the wind is at the, whether it's tailwinds or headwinds, as Marjorie noted, it kind of depends on where you stand. For many, this is a really good thing. It's a movement because folks have done their homework. They've set their timetables and targets. They have a science-based target. They've purchased in record quantities renewable energy, and they can't wait to disclose how good they are and what a leader they are. They can't wait to tell their employees and their customers about their stunning record. For those companies, kudos to them, and they're going to be at the head of the class. For those who have postponed action on ESG, or they've postponed really strategic thinking about climate change from the corporate board on down, it's going to be much more difficult. And the laws are coming down the pike, from, again, methane regulation to absolutely mandatory climate risk disclosure to any number of other rules around infrastructure that are going to shift the energy, the investment, the resources toward the clean energy economy and away from the existing fossil fuel economy. That is the direction of travel, no matter what sector you're in. So companies need to really get on with that movement and prepare for it, and have a strategy for how to manage that transition, because we're definitely going to see this kind of change coming in any number of forms. In addition to the legislative piece, as I said, there are all those other pressure points that would be there independently of the Build Back Better project or the Biden administration's leadership. So those are there no matter what. Investors, left-leaning groups, your employees, your customers.
Thanks. Judith, how different is this in different parts of the world? And how do companies deal with that? And then I do want to get to Swami. So we've had a couple of questions also, and I think that they're partially answered, but as you're thinking about your responses, all of you, Jane Nelson from Harvard has asked about what are the 3 or 4 priority actions large asset holders should take to accelerate and scale and in both asset managers and corporations. So just think about that. And Jeff Selkowitz has asked, how should companies think about the just transition, which you were just talking about, for environmental justice, and prepare for a net zero roadmap strategy? What does it look like? And I raise those now, and then I'm going to have Judith talk a little bit about the global, because if Swami can still give us some thoughts about how he dealt with this at J&J when he was the president of Vision Care. It might be interesting to see how one company has taken this and worked with it, and then we can come back if we haven't answered the questions. Judith.
So I think the one constant that I hear all the time is that regardless of level of executive, whether it's a vice president, a director, a manager, someone sitting in the C-suite or on the board, climate is one of those things that keeps everyone up at night. I think the realization has hit that this is a pressing issue that needs to be addressed, but also it's the realization that it does fit on everyone's plate. I think originally there were probably companies in different sectors that were more thoughtful about recognizing that this was going to impact them directly. But I think we're seeing this come across the board because everyone at the end of the day does have responsibility around it. But the difference that I do see is that the way it manifests itself is different. In some countries, we see that there is more advanced legislation in the works. And I think Anne has talked about some of the things that are coming down the pipeline in the US. But I think to answer Jane's question as well, the legal dimension, I think, is a really interesting one, because whether you're looking at it from legislation that's going to actually regulate certain parts of your operations or regulate your disclosures, it can also take the form, and this is the form that I think every company wants to avoid. You do not want to be called into a lawsuit in a country's Supreme Court and be accused of jeopardizing the future of the planet for future generations. And we are seeing that happen. We're seeing that there are courts in Africa, there are courts in Europe that are really taking what is a very progressive legal approach to try and address some of these issues. I think the other thing is the NGO pressure. We do a lot of work as APCO in terms of helping organizations figure out what is that narrative of how we should be talking about climate. How do we make something that is very often a very scientific and a very technical issue something that resonates and can engage everyone to take action? And I think we also see, related to the point that Jeff asked about environmental justice, we're seeing increasingly that those groups that are most affected by climate change are actually being supported and joined up by bigger, very often organizations with strong legal branches to actually come up with legally bound solutions. And I think, again, we see that happening a lot with Indigenous people. We see that happening with First Nations in Canada, Native American populations in the US, the communities in the Amazon and Indigenous communities in Africa, as well as in Australia. This is a very, from a risk perspective, as Anne said, this is something that general counsels and risk managers also have to take into account, is that very kind of extreme potential, not just of your reputation being tied up, but your assets being tied up if you fail to actually act with the necessary due diligence and act on the information that is available. So I think the modalities in which it shows up are different, but the constant about the need for either regulatory or societal pressure are there regardless of what part of the world you're looking at it from.
So I hope we can unmute Swami, but Swami was the CEO for Vision Care for Johnson & Johnson, and he had some thoughts about if we wanted to get a perspective as somebody who had to actually implement policy for companies. And I thought that would be useful. So Chris, can we unmute him? I don't know if we're...
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. We can. Thank you.
Got it. I'll try and be brief, but what I can share is across the world, while there is a willingness to talk about climate change and the issues around climate, the strongest region that we see is Europe. I've been hearing this from our customers, from our millennial consumers, as to what is J&J doing about climate and what actions are you taking. And 3 years ago, we started by recycling programs. But when we looked at the recycling program from an end-to-end perspective, it was truly not moving the needle. And that's when we engaged with the government in Ireland, and we started we actually set up a renewable, the windmill in our plant. And that was a massive capital expenditure. But with the government, we worked out a tax subsidy in such a way that, we got part subsidy. And the renewable energy that we generated in Limerick, a small village in Ireland, the excess we were able to feed back into the grid and give it to the Limerick township. Subsequent to that, we came to Jacksonville, Florida, and obviously wind is not a big factor there, but sun was a huge factor, and we worked with the state government. And I think one of your previous speakers referred about how the state governments are becoming increasingly savvy. We set up a small pilot program just by setting up solar panels above our parking slots. That was successful, and then we expanded it across our entire manufacturing plant. So today, almost 100% of our energy needs being fulfilled by renewable energy, and we are releasing the excess energy. We are storing it into our grids, and we are giving it back to the grid. So that's where we are now getting a claim where we are having a bigger impact. The third very pragmatic way in which we are doing it, we used to move all our product through air in the past. With the pandemic last year, we realized that some of the volumes had come down, and we have shifted to sea. And we find that that is again another significant, climate from a climate savings perspective and a decarbonization perspective. That's a huge saving as well. So we have now got an official claim from Deloitte, who has been monitoring our efforts. And that is something which will resonate a lot, particularly so in Europe. I think some of the other regions are dealing with a lot of existential challenges, but I would say Europe is probably the most advanced, followed by Canada and Australia. And now Japan is getting into the act. The other regions of the world are, there is some noise about it, but I think still at a primitive stage is how I would classify it. I hope it helps.
Thank you very much. It's always good to take our understanding of policy and activities and find out how it affects inside companies. And we could take this discussion on for a while about how you got to the point where you can make these choices for the company. So Heather, coming back to you and what we talked about before, what are some of those practical, what is the journey for companies? We happen to have an enlightened CEO who was able to push the company to do certain things. How prevalent is that, and what do you see happening going forward?
Just if I can go back from my We Mean Business Coalition to transitioning, because it's been such a, it's been so recent. As I was mentioning earlier in the conversation, that I think we're seeing a lot of the landscape getting more and more populated with more and more initiatives. And so I think that very practically, companies need to understand what that landscape is, who they are in that space, what sector they're in, what other sectors they're affecting, both on the customer side, whether that's consumer or B2B, and then understanding what their competitors are doing and how they can be aligned, right? And I think we're working with a company right now who's figuring out, where do we want to be? Do we want to be in the middle and play it safe? Do we want to come out and lead on some of these issues? And that's a really important thing that every company is figuring out while we are still in this space where we don't have regulation, we think it's coming, and what can you do to prepare for that, and how much do you want to stick your neck out, right? And I think some companies are really ready to do that and really excited, and some aren't quite so sure yet. And so developing that roadmap of, here are the steps that you need to take to decarbonize or to come up with a decarbonization plan, is a really important step there. And then going through, okay, what am I going to participate in? And just to bring back the Science-Based Targets Initiative piece for a moment, that's something that the 1.5 degree aligned science-based target for different sectors is an important first step or second or third step in getting to net zero as a company, because it helps to focus there. And then I would also say that looking at the ESG pieces is also going to help move into that decarbonization strategy, but also bringing in those elements. And Jeff, to your question and comment in the chat, which is, I think that environmental justice piece is very bespoke to different companies, depending on what they do, where they are, who they're affecting, who their employees are, who their customers are, and consumers. And so that's another piece of work that through APCO Impact, I think we can really help to put those pieces together, and through the ESG staff as well.
Heather, before you finish, while you're on the subject of what APCO can do, and Judith, feel free to jump in. Can you talk about what resources are already available that if people have clients or if they're interested, that we can share?
Yeah, absolutely. We have a series of webinars that we're going to be having. The next one is next Thursday. And Judith's going to join, and as well as Charlotte Higo from the London office, and we're going to cover COP26. And then along with Kristen Ford, Glenn Cross, and Allison Patch, we're going to cover transport for consumers and OEMs. And then we're going to do one on the built environment in July, and we'll be sharing the exact days and times with everyone shortly. And then we also just have some resources internally of like an APCO 2-pager and how climate is relevant for clients, how we can help support clients in that. I, myself, and Allison, and Judith, I'm volunteering you, and others are always available to join phone calls with clients. I've been doing a lot of that, and it's been really great to just see the energy and enthusiasm with clients and potential clients who are ready to do this. And again, that's a huge sea change from, I would say, even 6 or 8 months ago, from my experience at We Need Business, where it was still more of a pulling, and now there's a lot of we don't have to do that so much anymore.
Why don't we also mention about the tracking, because I'm going to come back to Anne on this, because there's so much happening. Can you talk about what Judith, you might want to mention what we're sending out if people want to sign up for a copy.
Yeah, yes, and there's an excellent climate tracker, but I don't know, Judith, if there was something else that you're thinking of. Yeah.
No, it was the
I
climate
forgot that.
tracker.
Sorry,
So
yeah, it is really excellent.
Why don't you explain what it is?
Go for it, Heather.
I wish Daniel Klingenberg was on the line, because he has been doing an amazing job with his team, putting together a weekly tracker of just everything that there is to follow. So as you can probably tell from the download we got from Anne, there's so much in the US regulatory space to be focused on. And that team's doing a wonderful job holding that with a little bit of analysis in place too, or linking to analysis, and then also making sure that we're all very aware of what's happening in the international space, as well as touching on some of the water, forestry, conservation pieces as well, and good coverage of the power sector too.
So I just wanted to mention that because it's such a resource that, and I think if people want to be on a list to get a copy, they can just let us know and we will make sure that happens.
I think, Marjorie, maybe just to complement what Heather has just said, I think one of the biggest challenges that companies face at the moment is that challenge between how to address their local stakeholders and the global stakeholders. I see that particularly much more with US companies, and with US companies that have, hardcore Republican stakeholders that they need to address. And I think this is one of the points where the document that Heather is talking about, but more broadly, where I think we're finding that there's a lot of ongoing conversation. If you're a company that is aspiring to play big on the global stage and has global stakeholders, the expectations are that come November at the very latest, you're going to have a pretty robust, but also very ambitious plan that is no longer looking towards 2050 for a major transition to net zero. Maybe you'll be able to get away with it if you're looking towards 2030, but increasingly we're seeing that there's a recognition that that deadline has to come sooner. And I think that juggling and that balancing act between how are you figuring out what your international obligations are, while at the same time making sure that your local constituents, which may even be your employees that are very reliant on traditional hydrocarbon sources or be part of supply chains that haven't been modernized, they have questions. And I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done, both from the employee engagement, with the engagement with stakeholders, and also with the engagement at different policymakers, that just in the same way as Heather talked, and you talked about how CEOs and company leadership is in different stages of awareness, we see that across the board with policymakers, with regulators and others. And yet at the same time, we can't forget that you also have very progressive evolution of, for instance, constitutions. Look at the Constitution of Kenya, actually has very constitutional level protections on climate change. So what we also see is a very uneven playing field at the international level, making it all the more complex to negotiate and find your way through it.
So we're getting short of time, but Anne, I wanted to come back to this question of authenticity and what you see both as part of an NGO and also in the discussions with different policy advocates in this area as a caution to companies about walking the talk. We've had a lot of people over time talk the talk, but I think we're in a different era of reality. And what do you see as the risk factor for people who get out ahead of what they can actually do?
Yeah, well, the risk factor is that it gets subjected to, EDF has something called an authenticity meter, actually. You can go to their website and see it. The risk is that the social media universe looks at it and says, we don't believe you, and here's the contradiction. And then they retweet that, literally a million times. It's really hard in the social media universe to get a handle on this. So it's definitely, it makes sense to be legitimate, credible, authentic, and I'm sure, APCO is helping you all to do that. I do want to say that I really like Swami's story about Florida, and that's an example of doing what you can do in a positive way. It was a state level solar project in Florida, where there's a lot of sun and where the state government really needs to be educated on the possibilities of solar. That's taking proactive action. Our colleagues at L'Oreal did something similar in North Arkansas, as well as in Louisville, Kentucky. They had to go to great lengths to do this with solar, but they made it happen. Proactive being for showing the promise and the economic opportunity of the transition to a clean energy economy. You can't do everything, but you can do special projects in special places. And then you can invite lawmakers to say, look at this thing that we did. And then, L'Oreal actually etched the names of every employee in the facility in North Arkansas into each individual solar panel. So now you're getting employee buy-in and you're moving the ball forward, even if you haven't been able to pass the proper regulation or law. When you get involved in policy, let me just underscore that you're not alone. There is a big friendly tent here of folks pushing policy forward. 411 companies and investors got behind pushing for a strong US climate goal for 2030. That's why we now have 50 to 52% reduction by 2030. So come on in, the water's fine. I hope that something like yesterday for many of our companies is a bit of a gateway drug. And once they start, they don't want to stop talking to lawmakers. So I really would support folks doing that. Things are changing quickly, but the good news is there are many on-ramps to this conversation. There are many ways in which companies can get involved. They don't have to have everything done perfectly. The final thing I'll say, because we're talking about the journey, is that Ceres published earlier this year the 2030 roadmap for sustainability. It's on our website. It's free and downloadable. And that's a vast improvement on our 2020 roadmap. And it covers all the things we've talked about. It covers the goal setting, environmental justice, employee engagement, public policy. I really recommend it. And it's dictated by what investors are seeking.
While you're on the subject of investors, what about the pledges to decarbonize their portfolios? Do you want to add anything in on that piece of it, since Jeff had that question?
Jeff, I saw that you asked that, and this represents a movement to say investors have pushed companies for a very long time. What about investors, looking at themselves and looking at their own portfolios? I would just say that this is new, but it's real, and companies should pay attention to this. And there's a tremendous movement to make sure that this happens. It's a vast project. And if you go to our website, there's a lot more details on just how this is going to happen. You're right, not all companies are paying attention to it, and I think they need to. What it's going to do is just continue to increase the pressure from investors that companies have already felt.
Well, we are out of time, but I just wanted to know if we did a round of speed dating, if you could give one piece of advice to those listening about how they can jump into the water, as you say, Anne, what would that be? So Heather?
There's no time like the present, and just start wherever you are.
And those of you at APCO, feel free to be in touch with Heather and the team about how you can get engaged, or how you can get engaged for your clients. Anne?
Talk to the youngest people in your organization for guidance.
And Judith?
Be bold and ambitious. You have to demonstrate where you want to get to, even though the path to getting there may not be easy.
So I hope this has been useful. This is, while it's not a new area to talk about, it certainly is contemporarily one of the most important things that we have to think about for our future. So stay tuned for our next session, and hopefully by the time we get through these sessions, you'll all be expert and be able to provide more advice and counsel within your own organizations or within APCO to our clients. So thank you for joining. Thank you for the great questions, and look forward to the next time. And thank you very much, Judith and Heather, for your help.
Thanks. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.